com, and I'm here with an attorney named Winston Shrout. He's focused in something called admiralty law, which I have heard about through a variety of insiders. Probably the most notable person to teach me about admiralty law has been Jordan Maxwell. A series of dinners that I had with him involving Project Camelot, where we sat down and he went through these mind-bending stories about this whole strange issue of admiralty law. And before that, I had another guy who actually claims to have worked on the Montauk Project, and he also was an expert on this stuff. So why are we going to do a whole show on admiralty law? What would you, as the listener, care about such an arcane subject? Well, here's why it matters. You're probably already aware by now that there is a cabal out there who have effectively seized control of the world's resources. We're talking about 80% of all the money that there is to be made in the world is actually money that is going through this cabal. The way they did this is by creating a systematic plan to confiscate the world's gold and resources and hold it on deposit with what we call the Federal Reserve and its international counterpart, the Bank for International Settlements. This plan seems to have been orchestrated in the late 1700s. Part of it involved Adam Weishaupt and the founding of what's known as the Bavarian Illuminati. It actually was just called the Illuminati, but it was founded in Bavaria, which is now subsumed into Germany. And during that same year, Adam Smith wrote a massive 709-page monster document called The Wealth of Nations. And this book created a criteria for the world leaders to believe that they could not have peace on earth unless they completely got rid of all of their gold holdings. Well, this was a big ruse because what these Federal Reserve guys were able to do is spend the rest of the 1700s and the 1800s consolidating their control over the world's financial supply, over the media, building a massive membership coalition by creating the Freemason organization and pumping up its ranks. We also documented in my epic work, Financial Tyranny, how there was a financial takeover of the British government by the Rothschild family. In fact, Nathan Rothschild was able to trade the British stock. There was a stock called consolidated annuities or consols, and the consols essentially were the stock of the British government itself. And because people didn't know whether Britain had been defeated in a battle with Napoleon that was going to define the outcome of the war, when Nelson Rothschild started to sell all these consols, everybody thought that the war was lost, and he created a massive financial panic, which led to people just dumping their stock at incredible prices. And right at the very, very last minute of trading, he completely bought up what everybody had sold at pennies on the dollar, and it's estimated that his net wealth increased by something like 4,000 times. And in that one single movement, he was able to effectively buy the control of the British government and its economy. Now, the reason why this is so significant is, as I said, Mayer de Rothschild had 5 children, and he treated this like a multinational corporation. Each of these children went to a different country, and using their insider connections, were effectively able to seize control of these economies. And as it turns out, these same countries and these same economies have become the predominant economic force on earth. So as we go through the 1800s, they consolidated their control, and there was another revolutionary change in this organization through the consolidation of Italian Freemasonry with a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini and American Freemasonry with a guy named Albert Pike. Mazzini and Pike got together and essentially healed a massive divide that had existed amongst these secret societies. They basically crushed the opposition, got everybody together on the same page, and then drafted up a plan for 3 world wars. World War I was intended to consolidate all the Balkanized republics into the Soviet Union, and it succeeded. And what we now know is that at the tail end of World War I, the plan then involved using the atrocities of World War I to justify these countries secretly pooling their golden resources into this Bank for International Settlements. Now, we can also go back and look to see that what triggered World War I was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Spain, and that assassination appears to have been utterly and completely an inside job. To get the U.S. involved, we have the sinking of the USS Maine, which also appears to have been completely an inside job, all intended to pull the strings behind the scenes and start World War I. Now, I understand as you're listening to this that you might be feeling overwhelmed, you might be feeling anxiety, and it might very well be that in order to feel psychologically comfortable, you have to attack me and feel hatred towards me for saying these things. I want to be clear that I didn't make this. And I also want to be clear that denial is not going to solve this problem. We have to look unerringly at the truth, and we have to see what happened. So what happened is, we have really good intel on this. I wrote a whole book about it on my website, how these people effectively, from the 1700s right up through the 1800s, crafted this plan. And by creating such a massive, horrific event. I mean, World War I, for all intents and purposes, is the most outrageous, negative thing that's ever happened on Earth. That event, everybody was completely exhausted. All these world leaders read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and they bought into it. They actually felt like the only way they could avoid another war happening, which would be even worse, is to give up all their gold to these bankers. And they did it. They handed over the gold, and what we're now hearing is that there's a lot more gold that they handed over that was secretly held in Asia than we knew. And that's because apparently Asia has a massive, massive mine of gold in it that's much bigger than any other gold mine in the world, except for another one that's very classified in Australia. So this is going to lead to admiralty law. Bear with me. This is all set up for what we're talking about. The world leaders handed over their gold, and apparently it began with a meeting in 1921. Emperor Hirohito from Japan came over to London, and that's where the plan started to be laid out. The world leaders, this is a documented fact, you can go prove this just by reading the documents on the Bank for International Settlements website. They actually have it right on their website. You can go in and read the charter documents where it says that they took everybody's gold in the world. It became illegal to hold gold. Some of the countries handed it over voluntarily. Those who did not were systematically plundered, and this is what actually leads to World War II and the events leading up to World War II, including a comprehensive purging and invasion of China and their gold supplies and much of Southeast Asia by an operation run by Japan as a proxy state for the Rothschild Empire, through what was called the Golden Lily. And Emperor Hirohito was not directly involved in this, but he allowed General Yamashita to basically pursue this goal and go and plunder this gold throughout China and Southeast Asia. That gold was, quote-unquote, put on deposit with the Bank for International Settlements. And what happened was the Federal Reserve, through their 12 member banks here in the United States, issued bonds to the people whose gold was confiscated in proportion to what was taken. The part that so many people are having trouble with is the actual amounts of gold involved in this heist, because it is vast. We're talking about nearly 2.5 million metric tons of gold, which is much, much larger than the established, documented score of there being approximately, you can read it anywhere between 120,000 metric tons to 160,000 metric tons. So we have some guys who are blasting me on the internet about this, saying, oh my God, there's no way that there could be that much gold because everything's been mined and meticulously cataloged. It's like, look, if you want to believe that the government tells you the truth and that there is no man behind the curtain, that's fine. But there are very large gold mines, and China considered this a great national secret, but the Rothschilds did find out about it, and they grabbed up that gold. Whether you like it or not, what we're seeing is extensive photographic documentation of what these bond boxes actually look like. The guy who I have on the air with me now, Winston Shrout, I can hear him champing at the bit wanting to jump into this conversation. So Winston, how do you factor in on all this? Everything I've said up until now, what's your opinion on all that? And what are we looking at here?
Well, basically, let me go back and correct one thing.
Okay.
First off, I am not an attorney. There are maritime attorneys that do specialize in maritime law. If you wanted to put a label on me, you might call me a non-union lawyer.
Okay.
And that might be close to it. But basically, I'm self-taught, have no degrees in law, haven't gone to no law school or anything like that.
Okay.
So let's, you asked me how what we're doing today factors into this. And so maybe I could just start right there and explain it, because it's, as I understand it, there has been some controversies raised over the concept.
Lost their gold to basically what amounts to the G5 and the G7 countries that orchestrated this systematic worldwide gold takeover. They lost their gold. We have photographs of the Federal Reserve bond boxes. They're extensive. We have multiple examples of people trying to steal these Federal Reserve bonds, and the bonds being seized, and in every single case, the media says that it's fraudulent. What's now happened is that these countries in the world have formed an alliance to arrest people in the Federal Reserve. Just like you saw with Occupy Wall Street, they weren't going against the government, they were going against the finance industry. And that's really what we're up against here. So these mass arrests are going to be accomplished through the use of admiralty law. And that's where the meat of the story is. That's why the sizzle is there. That's why it's important to understand admiralty law. Because these people use admiralty law. I know something about it, probably nowhere near as much as you do, Winston. But you can't do this with regular corporate law because of all the safeguards that they've worked in to protect themselves. And yet, admiralty law is what these so-called Illuminati, or the cabal, that's what they use on the inside. It ties all the way back to marine, people on ships, and the fact that the early Illuminati were the Knight Templars, and the way that they were fighting this battle back in the day was with the spice trade, and all that involved ships and sailing on the ocean. And so they actually created the pirates. The pirate flag with the skull and crossbones is a Knight Templar / Masonic / Illuminati symbol. And they had to dominate the sea, and that's where I think all these laws probably got started. But maybe you know more about this than I do, Winston. So let's dive into this, because I want everybody to remember that the apex of our story here is how we're actually going to bring peace to the world and defeat these guys. So go ahead.
Okay, let me give one short definition that might be helpful, and that is, the word fraud itself. First off, you have to understand that all commerce is actually done in fraud. The reason being that we're dealing with weights and measures. And so what we're doing, we're going out and assigning a number to something that exists in reality. Consequently, it's an abstract of that. It's a fiction, or what we would call a fraud. Now, when we're dealing in commerce, in fraud, that's the method we use unless it injures a real man. Now, if the fraud causes an injury to a man, then we stop the fraud. we correct the injury, we redress the injury, and then we go back to doing fraud because, again, that's the method we have when we're using abstract instead of reality. So that's one. Now there are some definitions and statutes as far as fraud, constructive frauds, implied frauds, and all manner of things that have been brought up. But when we're dealing in commerce, again, because we're dealing with weights and measures, everything operates in a fictional / fraudulent manner, which is okay as long as it doesn't injure. So we have to make that distinction when we start talking about commerce and so forth. Now let me also give another definition that might be helpful, and that is the difference between the words commerce and trade. Originally, commerce had reference to the king and his business concerns, and trade referred to what the merchants did. Now, over a period of time, historically, basically commerce and trade have been melded together on the basis that the merchants are using the king's currency to do their business, and in consequence of that, then we've melded commerce and trade together. For instance, pretty much everybody in the world is dealing with U.S. dollars, or what we call Federal Reserve notes. Mm-hmm. And so commerce and trade have been melded together. But being that as it may, the world of commerce is basically enforced through the Admiralty. Now, again, the Admiralty is the king, belongs to the king. He uses the military to enforce his commerce. But again, since we have melded trade and commerce together, then at this point, the merchants are also using Admiralty to enforce their maritime contracts.
When people hear you saying these things, their first inclination is going to be, well, this guy's just giving us a bunch of BS. So
sure.
Why is it that we can seek this information out? I mean, how do you find this stuff? How do you know that what you're saying is actually true? Because I always try to... Go ahead.
Well, the way we know that it's true is because it works.
Why don't you explain that?
Well, it's like anything else. For instance, a carpenter, he goes into his toolbox and he has many tools in there. And each tool is, will do a specific job. For instance, a hammer will drive nails, but you could also use a pair of pliers to drive a nail. It's just a whole lot slower process. So when we start to talk about what tools shall we use to get the job done, we start talking about commerce and trade and all these kind of things. We start to look in our toolbox to find what kind of tool would best facilitate the operation that we're attempting to do. And so when we get involved in commerce, we've developed a whole toolbox, if I could use that example there. We have a whole toolbox of various things that could be used in a particular situation to accomplish a certain end. And so that's why we've, resorted to a commercial lien tool in regards to the 2.5 million metric tons of gold that's in question here. So again, it's just a tool. There's nothing holy or mystical or anything about it. It's just a tool that we use.
Okay, before we get to that, because that is really the meat of our discussion.
Okay.
How do we know that this Admiralty law is even real? Is there any place that the people who are interested could read about it?
Sure.
Okay.
The best place to understand Admiralty and the concepts thereof is the King James Version of the Holy Bible. In particular, if they'll make reference in the book of Genesis to the Garden of Eden story, I think you get a concept for how the admiralty works. One of the first things you have to understand is understand the concepts of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is in the admiralty. It's not in common law. It's in the admiralty. So if you go back to the Garden of Eden story as an example, whether it's a metaphor, a true story, a real account, is not the question here. But the example that's laid there is with, apparently Adam and Eve got into a situation whereas God had told them that we're going to, if you do this, I'll destroy you. See? And so, but in consequence of their action, he moved them from one jurisdiction into a new jurisdiction. And so technically he moved them out of law and moved them into the admiralty under bankruptcy reorganization so that they would have the opportunity to repent before they died, you see. And so the first instance we have of these kind of processes and thoughts and so forth actually started with the Garden of Eden story.
Are you ascribing significance to the idea that the King James Version was designed by these same cabal to some degree, and that they put that in there to set the precedent for usury and this whole system that they've created?
I wouldn't say that in particular. I think there may be some misunderstandings about King James Version. Certainly it's not the only version, and there's many versions, and there's plenty of apocryphal books and all manner of things out there to glean from. But in particular, King James Version was created to be used in the churches and courts. It was authorized for use in the churches and courts. And so in consequence of that, the translation from the various books and so forth that they had to use at that time, the translation was overseen by a man named Robert Flood. Now, Robert Flood was a contemporary with Sir Francis Bacon and John Dee. Right. Now, of course, John Dee being in his lifetime, aside from other things, he was also the Grand Master of the Priory of Zion. Right. Which was a secret society created to protect the Holy Bloodline, as, his history shows us. Now, actually, Robert Flood did, in fact, succeed John Dee in that capacity. But during the time when the translation into King James Version, Robert Flood was the man who oversaw the translation. And I suppose that he was responsible for the inclusion of certain books and the exclusion of other books. And so obviously then Robert Flood skewed that version for a particular purpose. Whether that was for evil or for good, I can't say. But we have what we have today. And so to answer your question in regards to the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story, I don't know what the intent of it was, but certainly we
have been in a state of national emergency ever since.
Okay, let me say they re-declared bankruptcy. The first declaration of bankruptcy was the Articles of Confederation. The second declaration was the Constitution for the United States of America. Now, the Chapter 11 that they went into was as a result, as you say, of having taken up the gold so that they can no longer execute contracts which brought an end to common law. I'm hoping I'm not confusing you here.
And you're saying common law separate from admiralty law?
Of course.
Yeah. I'm just trying to make that...
Common law is based on use, it's based on history, it's based on the precedents of the particular people. For instance, when the United States was being formulated, the founders decided to use English common law. Now, why did they pick English common law, for instance, over Anglo-Saxon common law? Well, the reason they did, because they were all Englishmen. Now, is English common law preferable to Anglo-Saxon common law? It depends on your point of view. But anyway, that's what they chose as the forum that they would use to settle disputes and to do contracts and business and so forth.
Does common law deal with trade rather than commerce based on your earlier... Okay.
No. Commerce and trade are based on what's known as law merchant law. Now, law merchant law is substantive law. Because of the situations in the 1800s, they formulated what was known as negotiable instruments law to facilitate trade and commerce. And then eventually in the last century, then they formulated the Uniform Commercial Code to basically standardize commerce and resolution disputes all over the planet. But it's not common law. It has nothing to do with common law.
So what I'm hearing you say is that countries make their own laws for their own individual jurisdiction. But yes. there is also an overarching law that is used to regulate commerce and trade between nations.
Absolutely.
And that the most current form of it would be Uniform Commercial Code.
Yes, as it implies, Uniform Commercial Code, you understand that it's a complete fiction. But again, because we're operating in in fictional terms when we get involved in commerce, and this.
We lost your audio. Can you hear me, buddy? You totally winked out.
Okay, then.
Okay, there you are. You're back.
Okay. Let
me ask you the question again.
Sure.
So we're talking about Uniform Commercial Code, and we just lost your audio, so I want you to start again with what you were going to tell us.
Well, when you're operating in a fictional world, then you operate with codes. It's not necessary to use Uniform Commercial Code because you can, in fact, enforce your maritime contracts, which are substantive, without the use of a fictional code. But when we start to talk about international commerce and how do we settle disputes or misunderstandings or whatnot, then we have a reference to go to if there's no other existing contract to deal with. See, the Admiralty and Maritime deal with contract, and you can create your own contract, and we have many times. That's why I tell people, many instances, they say, well, we're having this difficulty over here, we're having this difficulty over there. Well, I said, the problem is you haven't tightened up your contracts and you're allowing equity to seep in and cause you the problems. So I tell them, tighten up your contracts. For instance, people generally go out and sign an SS5 form to get a Social Security account and so forth, and the whole thing operates as a SESTA-KV trust. Whereas they're implied as the trustee, and look at all the problems it's caused to all the people across America. So I say, go tighten up that situation. Go back, re-indenture your trust, and turn it into an express trust, so it's not being operated as the SESTA-KV. And so in most of the problems that people across the country are facing, because they're involved in implied adhesion contracts and all manner of things. And so I say, hey, go back into the Admiralty, go back into that jurisdiction, reestablish your contracts, tighten them up, and you won't be having the problems you're having.
Right. So you had mentioned admiralty and maritime law as if those were different things.
They used to be, but at this point here, because again, everybody's using one currency, then both of them have basically melded together. It is possible that you could split them out. In other words, you could go back into maritime if you stopped using, the king's currency. Now that could be possible if in fact, you were dealing with a national currency.
I guess something that we still need to address here is I asked you where people could read more about this so that they know that you're not just making all this up. And all you really said is go read the Bible, which is going to make people very angry.
Why would that make them angry?
Because there's nothing technical in the Bible about any of these laws. It's only sort of like a metaphorical story. I
might disagree with that because it is very technical. An analysis of the Old Testament versus the New Testament certainly would be important to make, because when you get into the New Testament, it does become very technical, especially when you get into the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written by someone who understood commerce very well. Perhaps it was Paul. I don't know if or not. But in any event, you see in the book of Hebrews, very technical terms and so forth. And so as a first primer, if I can use that term, the King James Version would be a very good first primer. And again, it was created for a particular purpose, and it was authorized for use. Listen now, it was authorized for use in the churches and the courts. So if people are having problems in court, could they rely upon the concepts, principles, and so forth that are contained in the King James Version? And the answer is yes, if they understood them. Now, first off, let me explain that the free enterprise system, the commercial things that we do all across the planet are inventions of Christianity. Now, I didn't say they were good or bad. I'm just saying they were invented by Christianity. See, we're not involved in the barter system. We're not involved in the system, that was developed by the pagan nations. We're involved in a new system. And again, it was invented as a result of the Europeans promoting Christianity. Now, if you go back through history, there were times back in history when it looked like Europe was going to turn Muslim. There were invasions and things, and except for a few small glitches, that whereas the Christians won, but if it hadn't been for those things that happened historically, we would not be operating with the commercial system that we presently have. So, again, as a first primer to understanding commerce, the concepts, principles, and so forth that are contained in King James Version would be essential. Not that I'm promoting Christianity, please.
Okay. Well, what do you see in the book of Hebrews that you say is significant enough to warrant being a preliminary legal code?
Well, let me give you a brief rundown then, because we see this played out again in our history, certainly since 1933. If you look at the Old Testament, it dealt with execution of law. In other words, in order to discharge the debt, there had to be the shedding of blood, and usually they used a scapegoat or a straw man to accomplish that. Now, that did not mean, of course, that the debt was gone. It means it was discharged into the future.
I'm trying not to interrupt you because I've had tons of haters say that I interrupt too much, and I guess I get excited. So I'm trying to just let you talk, but then there's other people who are going to get mad because I'm not interrupting you when you say outrageous things.
Outrageous?
Yeah, it's
now.
You're saying that the Old Testament says that if you want to pay your debt, any debt, if you want to discharge your debt, that you have to shed blood, you have to kill something? I don't understand that.
Well, let's make this definition. the word we use in commerce is the word debt. If you go into theology, into Christian theology, the word is sin. So sin and debt, at least to me, are exactly the same word. For instance, you look in the New Testament, some would come to Jesus and say, I need to be forgiven of my sins. And he say, your debts are forgiven.
Oh, you're right. I remember that. Yeah.
If you look at the Lord's Prayer, it says, forgive us this day our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, that's purely commercial. And so we say these same principles, played out today.
Okay, but let's get back to the bloodshed. I didn't get that.
All right, yeah. Well, the reason I mentioned that is because in the Old Testament concept, it deals with the execution of law. Now, this is very similar to what we have had in our modern times that we call the common law. Common law called for an execution of the contract in order to close the escrow on it. And so the Old Testament and our common law are very similar. We stopped execution and went into operation, which is altogether different concept. But I need to lead up to that, and I'm using the King James Version as a comparison so that it's easily seen.
Okay.
Now, the concept of execution stopped with a man that's referred to as John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the last legal administrator of the Levitical law. Now, his blood was shed at the end of that testament. He became the testator, and which demonstrates that the Old Testament is a will and has to be dealt with in probate, which is a little bit different law form than most people are familiar with. However, after the death of John, there was a period of time. I mean, how long it was, 6 months, a year, whatever. But anyway, a new contract was let, if I can use that word, and the testator of the New Testament, the new contract, was a man historically known as Jesus, whose blood was shed at the start of the contract, which demonstrates that the contract is in the form of a trust. So, when you get involved in the New Testament, we're starting to talk about operation of law and not execution. Now, there's many concepts that go along with operation of law as it's outlined in the New Testament that we see again played out in 1933.
Okay.
In 1933, when they gathered up the gold, however they got it, through war, voluntarily, whatever, but when the gold was centralized, then the ability to pay a debt in substance ceased. So it is impossible from 1933, even right through the present, to execute a contract. The only thing a contract can be done with is it can be discharged. Now, it is possible, as we've developed the technology, to do a set-off for close of escrow. But when you start talking about the circumstances after 1933, then you're talking about operation of law, which is a very close parallel to the very same thing that you see in the New Testament. So that's why I was saying that the study of King James Version is very helpful in getting a fix on how things actually work today.
Well, it's interesting when you sign your last will and testament, right? That word always has to be included, testament.
Correct.
And I had never thought about the fact that you have the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly again, you're saying that John the Baptist was somehow the trustee for the Old Testament? And Jesus...
Not trustee. No, it was a will situation. If anything at all, you know, again, it's representative of what had happened, you know, prior to that time. And so when he shed his blood, or when his blood was shed for him, that was the end. And so the will could be executed by the executor, and the executor, according to our theology, you know, was God. So we had the executor come in under probate and deal with the sins and debts that had been discharged into the future, that was waiting upon a redeemer. You see, any system of debt that does not have a redemption is simply an open contract that runs forever and ever. You can't close contract unless you bring in the concept of redemption. And so for the last number of years, many of us have been involved in what we refer to loosely as commercial redemption. And we have accepted the Redeemer in commerce for close of contract.
Wow.
Close of escrow on contract. Now that, you know, it might take us a week to fully develop that concept and that thought process, but again, we're trying to get to the point where we have some logical explanation for what was done with a commercial lien involving the gold in question.
Okay.
So we're kind of leading up. We're kind of leading up to that.
I'm still, in my mind, hearing screaming voices of people who are going to say, this guy is completely delusional. He's taken the Bible and twisted it into all these crazy things. He's probably against Christianity, and he's trying to make it all out like it's some Illuminati plot. You know, and there's going to be people who are really angry listening to this. And, you know, that's okay, because what we're trying to do is get to the information. But I've heard about this admiralty law for quite some time. I know that when you're in a court that has a gold fringe around the flag, that means that they're operating under this law. But where would someone actually read about all this crazy stuff that you're saying? How would someone actually for themselves, if they want to follow up on this and learn more, and they're interested but they might not understand everything, where can you read about this?
I guess some of the same places I've read about it for about the last 7.5 years. You know, I've been doing public seminars discussing many of these same concepts.
Okay.
And have supplied, you know, multitudes of articles, documents, and all manner of things to help supplement, you know, that learning. Let me just say this: the ability to operate in this manner is actually an art form. It's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 situation, although some things are that way. But for the most part, it's an art form. And so you're operating, you're not executing. And so when you understand the concepts, the principles, you know, that apply here, then again, you know, it's more of an art form than it is a strict regiment of how to do. It's not a, you know, how to do admiralty, you know, with 100 steps in it. It's just not there.
Right. But there should at least be some documentation that you can say right now on the air of where somebody can go. Give us a reference, give us a place, give us a website address, something that people.
I don't know of any particular documentation. If they want to have a start at it, just go on the internet and type in law, merchant law, and first off learn the history of law, merchant law, and see how that goes. If you want to go back and study the history of City of London, if you want to study how the Knights Templars operated with their banking and gold certificates and all those kind of things, then I think those kind of things might be helpful to them. But I don't know of anybody that's compiled a book that would adequately even start to describe the situation, except for King James Version. But again, remember, it's an art form.
But you can go on Google for all intents and purposes and start to Google things like Uniform Commercial Code, Admiralty Law, etc. And you're going to start finding pieces of this and put it together.
Sure. Yeah.
And
merchant law.
Okay.
The Negotiable Instruments Act, I think it was 1857. You can study that. And then there's a whole body of law called negotiable instruments. Actually, that's one of the first things that I studied. It was actually a college course. And I got it on audio with some paperwork and so forth with. So that's the first thing that I studied actually was negotiable instruments law. And so having an understanding of that, then I could backtrack into, Negotiable Instruments Act, and back into the concepts of banking, gold certificates, checks, and all those kind of things. So that might be a good, I think there perhaps are, several courses you might find on the internet that you could go back and study negotiable instruments. That's an important thing.
Well, one of the things that keeps popping up in my mind is, and I'm trying to remember the exact reference, but I believe it was in the Congress building. I think it's in the Congress building. One of my top insiders was telling me that if you know what you're doing, you go down into the basement and there's a door that says boiler room, and that's all it says. And you open up the door and you go inside, and that's an Admiralty Law court. It's a secret court behind the door that says boiler room, which apparently has to do with the boiler being back to steamships and this whole marine weird law, that there's like this other form of law that these guys have been using that the people don't even know about. And so I think this is really one of the keys we got to get to here is that people think go ahead.
Let me help you out with some of that thought process. First off, you had mentioned the gold fringe flag, which denotes an Admiralty court. But whether or not there's a gold fringe flag in the court, I can guarantee you that all of the courts in this country are all Admiralty courts. The reason being is that, again, this country operates in bankruptcy, which is under the Admiralty jurisdiction. You can't get away from it. And if you look at any court case, except some that I file, if you look at any court case in the courts, you'll see that it's Admiralty procedure because, number one, the defendant that is being sued or complained against is a thing, which demonstrates that it is an in rem proceeding. In other words, a thing is being sued. They're not suing people. They're suing things. Because, again, the defendant will always be in uppercase letters, which under the U.S. Styles Manual, if you want to go read that, that might be interesting. But anyway, under the U.S. Styles Manual, it will tell you that anything that's in all uppercase letters is either a U.S. vessel, a corporation, or a dead person. And if you go out to the cemetery, equity, which most times they do. But all these courts operate in the Admiralty. There aren't any common law courts in the country. Now you can turn a court into an in-law proceeding if you know how to do that.
Well, I remember also one of my insiders who was really into this stuff telling me that he had signed a marriage certificate, I believe, in the 1970s, and that even at that late state in the game, if you actually read the legalese on the marriage certificate, it says, I hereby pledge, or it says, we hereby pledge the issue of our marriage as serf and servant of the state.
Absolutely.
And the issue of our marriage means your children.
Absolutely.
And you sign that contract.
They refer to the operation in a marriage as sexual commerce.
Oh, wow.
When you want a benefit from the state, you go and sign an application for that benefit. Now, as a result of signing the application, the state may grant you a license. A license, if you look at the definition of it, license is defined as permission from the state to do something that is otherwise illegal, immoral, or unlawful. So, when you go and sign the application for the marriage, the state may, and usually do, issue a marriage license, which allows you to engage in sexual commerce under the probation of the state. And the issue that comes from the sexual commerce is, in fact, the property of the state. But there's some things you can do with those situations.
Such as?
Well, what we've been doing, we've done several things, with those situations so that the parents could have more control over the outcome of the upbringing of their children and so forth. Many people, for instance, have used the UCC-1 financing statements and list the children on there as secured collateral and so forth. One of the other things that has been done is we've gone back and claimed the birth certificate and used it again in commerce as collateral, perhaps for a lien or other things such as that. But for the most part, if people are careful, they won't run into problems and won't need to do those kind of things. But for those from time to time, they run into situations, especially when they get involved in divorce courts and all kind of things, then perhaps the outcome of the issue, it might be something that has to be dealt with. And so we have developed technologies that are helpful to parents dealing with some of those kind of situations. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example of this. One of my friends up in Canada, a native man up there, he had developed technology to liberate children from the government schools. If you studied the situation up there, you know how desperate the children are in those government schools. So he had developed certain technologies and so forth where he could actually go and liberate the children away from the government schools and return them to their families. And so we've used these technologies in various places, for different situations. But again, it's all, if you understand the correct procedures and things and so forth in commerce, how the thing works, again, look in your toolbox, see which tool you need to accomplish a certain job, and then go out and use it.
Okay.
And I really don't think that people that listen to this are going to be offended by it. They might question it because it might be new to them, but I don't think between the conversation you and I have had that we've said anything that should offend anybody. The proof in what we're talking about is in the successful application of what we're talking about.
Right. And the anger that people have to some degree is just out of a feeling of vulnerability.
They're angry at themselves. They're not angry at you or I. They're angry at themselves. You know that.
Well, what you're telling me is that all of the things that we're talking about are actually hidden in the legalese. Not
in legalese. No. Yeah, you have to understand that law merchant, as I mentioned, law merchant law is substantive law. It deals with real things. And so we're not talking about legalese here. We're talking about reality. And so when we start to, creating paperwork and get into court and talking all those kind of things, it's all basically gibberish. But the reality is the results of what we do. And like I say, you can't argue with a guy that can liberate 300 children away from the government. Now, legalese or whatever it is that he used to get there is one thing. But again, the proof of what he was doing was the return of the children to their families. And so, we're not talking about fictions here and all this kind of thing in so much as we use fictions to accomplish a certain goal. Now let's talk about, for instance, people want to get into business. They want to operate a store. They want to operate a farm. They want to run a construction business and all these kind of things. Would these elements that we're bringing up here be of a benefit to them in those endeavors? And the answer is yes, very much so.
Okay. How would that happen?
Well, for instance, let's say you want to be a contractor and you want to go out here and build houses and so forth. And so in order to get insurance, to be a contractor, you have to have a license and all those kind of things. So, there's nothing particularly intrinsically bad about that, but it's how you use that license, it's how you deal with the insurance, it's how you deal with construction bonds and so forth that would show you either a profit or a loss. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example of this. Now, this might sound a little far-flung, but one of the individuals that I've worked with over the years is, in fact, an electrical contractor. And he had a successful business, and he had built his business up to the point that he could go out and bid on, perhaps up to like a $2 million job. And so he was very successful at it. And so on occasion, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, he got into a squabble with one of the major banks about something. I'm not sure what it was. But anyway, he went through an administrative process, and then he went and did the commercial lien process, perfected the commercial lien, and certainly after 90 days, the commercial lien turned into a security. Now, he asked me, what can I do with this? I said, go ask your CPA if in fact they can take that security and lodge it as an asset in your business. So he went to his CPA, a lady, she had about like 30 years experience. He said, can you lodge in this commercial lien into my business? She said, yes, it'll take me about 2 days to get it in there. So she went to work, and sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, his commercial lien showed up as an asset to his business. Now, the commercial lien was for $9 billion. So now all of a sudden, his business, instead of having, assets that look like $2 million, now he has a business with assets that look like $9 billion. Now, what kind of job do you think he can bid on with a $9 billion asset?
Anything he wants.
Most anything he wants. You see, this is actually how it works. So people say, well, how can these things be beneficial? Well, there's a perfect example of it.
Bring in another subject, because there's a lot of stuff that Jordan Maxwell would be saying if he was here, and I'm probably going to get this all wrong, and you're going to have a very long-winded explanation of how wrong I am, but
okay.
That's okay.
Sure.
This is all going to be transcribed, so people will probably be able to make a lot more sense out of this when they read it as opposed to listening to it.
Very good.
One of the things that Jordan has said is, and I've heard this from others as well, that when you are born, you become, and I probably am going to get the wording all wrong, you become collateral for the government, and they issue money secretly against your birth. You have these accounts. I've heard that one source, more than one source actually very credible, has told me there's 10 different accounts. And that when you get your Social Security card, you can turn it around on the back, and you'll see this red number there that's called your stock number. And it turns out you have 10 of these. And Each one of them is worth millions of dollars. It's an account that's then packaged into a mutual fund when you're born, and it's an account held in your name, and technically you do own these accounts, and technically money is issued against these accounts in Federal Reserve notes, so that when you look at a dollar or a $20 bill or a $100 bill, you see this number on it, and we've been led to believe that each bill has a separate serial number, when in fact, according to what I've heard, there are tons of bills out there that have the same numbers, because each of those numbers that you see represents someone's account. And so when they're stealing money, there's an occult system involved in which the stealing of the money is the stealing of people's body that stock has been issued against. So I'm interested if you have heard anything about this. And
oh, yes.
Okay.
Well, let me explain some of that. And first off, the word occult itself is not a voodoo word. All it means is something that's hidden.
Right.
So it's not a voodoo word. It's just a description of something that perhaps you don't know about today, but you could learn about tomorrow.
Okay.
So going back, this all has to do with the concept of original issue. It also has to do with the concept of exemption. So let me explain briefly what this process here, and it goes back, believe it or not.